The morning mist spread like a veil over the dense forest, hiding ancient secrets in the shadows of the towering trees. It was a place where time seemed to have stopped, where every leaf and every trunk bore the marks of passing seasons. In this setting, where silence was only broken by the occasional bird song or the soft sound of a stream, a story began to unfold that no one could have imagined. Sophia was a 6-year-old girl with large brown eyes that sparkled with curiosity and blonde curls that fell to her shoulders. She lived with her parents in a small village near the forest. Life in the village was simple and peaceful, marked by the rhythms of nature and the stories the elders told about the mysteries of the forest. Sophia had always been a cheerful and energetic child, but something had changed in recent months. Sophia's parents, Daniel and Elena, noticed that she had become more introspective, spending long hours watching the forest from her bedroom window. When asked, Sophia would just smile and say she liked listening to the stories the wind brought from the trees. Daniel and Elena thought it was just part of their daughter's vivid imagination, but they couldn't shake the slight unease at seeing this sudden change. To them, the forest had always been a place of magic, but also danger. Local tales spoke of creatures that roamed the shadows and of people who had disappeared, never to be seen again. But to Sophia, the forest seemed like a refuge, a place where she felt an inexplicable connection. She spoke about the animals that lived there as if they were her friends, describing them in detail that even the adults in the village didn't know. Everything began to change one autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell gently from the trees, forming a colorful carpet on the forest floor. Daniel and Elena were busy preparing the annual harvest, and Sophia, as usual, was playing in the garden in front of the house. She never strayed far, always respecting the invisible boundary between the garden and the forest. But that afternoon, something drew her into the trees. Perhaps it was the sound of an owl in the distance, or the glow of the last leaves illuminated by the sun. Whatever it was, Sophia stood up and, without looking back, entered the forest. The hours passed, and the sun began to set. Daniel and Elena, realizing that Sophia was taking longer than usual to return, began calling for her. But the only response they heard was the silence of the forest, now darkened by the approaching night. Panic began to grow within them as they searched the garden, calling Sophia's name with increasingly desperate voices. With no answer, they ran to the forest, shouting for Sophia, but the darkness and silence were their only companions. As minutes turned into hours, concern turned into overwhelming fear. The stories that once seemed like legends now became frightening possibilities. They knew they couldn't continue alone and rushed back to the village to ask for help. In no time, the villagers, armed with lanterns and torches, organized into search groups. The forest, which had previously been just a backdrop to their peaceful lives, now seemed like a living threat, swallowing everything they loved. As the search intensified, Sophia's parents were on the verge of despair. Every minute that passed without news of their daughter was torture, and the feeling of helplessness was unbearable. They tried to cling to hope, but the reality of the dark, cold forest pressed down on them, whispering fears they didn't dare to speak aloud. However, what no one knew was that Sophia wasn't alone. Deep in the forest, a pair of watchful eyes observed her. They were the eyes of a being that understood both fear and the instinct to protect. A majestic deer, with antlers rising like a crown on its head, had found the little girl asleep under a tree. He didn't know how or why, but he felt he had a mission: to protect this small, vulnerable creature until someone came to find her. The story was just beginning, and what would happen next was more extraordinary than anyone could predict. The search for Sophia continued through the night, with the villagers scouring every corner of the forest. The cold night air bit at their skin, and the growing fear fueled their determination. The hours seemed to drag on, and with each passing one, the hope of finding Sophia safe and sound began to wane. Meanwhile, deep within the forest, the deer remained by the sleeping girl's side. He was an imposing creature, with light brown fur and eyes full of wisdom. Next to Sophia, he looked like a silent sentinel, watching every sound and movement around them with keen attention. The girl, exhausted from her walk and fear, had fallen into a deep sleep, unaware of her new companion. The deer, however, was on high alert. He knew that the forest, despite its beauty, could also be treacherous. Predators prowled in the darkness, and the dangers were many for such a small and defenseless child. But the deer felt something beyond mere survival instinct. There was an inexplicable connection between him and Sophia, as if he knew his duty was to protect her at all costs. As the night wore on, the deer stayed vigilant, moving only to keep the girl warm. He lay down beside her, allowing his large, warm body to provide the heat needed to stave off the cold of the night. Sophia, even in her unconscious state, seemed to sense the protective presence beside her, instinctively cuddling closer to the deer. Meanwhile, back in the village, the news of the fruitless search began to spread, creating a sense of collective despair. The fear that something terrible had happened to Sophia was palpable, and the villagers began to prepare for the worst. But Daniel and Elena refused to give up. Even with eyes heavy from exhaustion and hearts full of pain, they continued to call out for their daughter, hoping that somehow she could hear them. With each step Daniel took into the forest, the weight of guilt grew heavier within him. He blamed himself for letting Sophia play alone, for not noticing in time that something was wrong. Elena, on the other hand, fought back the tears that threatened to fall at every moment, trying to keep hope alive for just one more second. Both knew that if they didn't find Sophia soon, they might lose more than just a child. They would lose the part of themselves that loved her unconditionally. As the search party spread out, the forest seemed to grow denser and more impenetrable. The sound of footsteps and voices echoed among the trees, but no response came from within the forest. The night was at its darkest, and the feeling of helplessness began to creep into everyone's minds. It was as if the forest was determined to keep Sophia in its shadowy embrace forever. However, while everyone battled against despair, something extraordinary was happening. The deer, which had remained silent until now, began to act strangely. He slowly stood up, moving around Sophia with an almost supernatural delicacy. His eyes were fixed on the darkness ahead, and his ears twitched restlessly, picking up sounds that only he could hear. Then, without warning, the deer did something that would surprise anyone who might have been present. He lowered his head and, with a gentle nudge of his antlers, began to softly push Sophia. The girl stirred, waking slowly, still enveloped in the warmth of the deer. Her eyes blinked sleepily as she tried to understand where she was. But upon seeing the deer, a sense of calm washed over her. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she felt protected. The deer looked deeply into Sophia's eyes, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. He knew he had to keep her safe until help arrived. Moving slowly, the deer guided Sophia through the trees, leading her away from the unseen dangers of the forest. The girl, without question, followed him, trusting instinctively in this majestic being that seemed to know exactly what to do. Minutes turned into hours, and the deer continued to guide Sophia through the forest, shielding her from danger and protecting her from the cold. Each step they took brought them closer to an unknown destination, but in their hearts, both knew they were on the right path. The deer didn't have a plan, but he trusted his instinct, which urged him to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, the search continued fruitlessly, and the night slowly gave way to dawn. The villagers' lanterns and torches still illuminated the forest's shadows, but hope was dwindling. For Daniel and Elena, time was running out, and every second that passed without finding their daughter was an unbearable pain. But in the darkness, where hope seemed lost, a small flame of a miracle was alight. The deer, with his ancient wisdom, was guiding Sophia away from danger and toward a future that no one could have foreseen. As the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, the forest took on a different life. The cold of the night started to fade, and the timid rays of sunlight brought a new energy to the land. Sophia, still following the deer, felt rejuvenated by the soft light filtering through the leaves. She was tired, but the constant presence of her guardian kept her going. Daniel and Elena, after a whole night of fruitless searching, were on the brink of exhaustion. Their bodies ached, their voices were hoarse from calling Sophia's name, and their hearts were tight with almost paralyzing fear. They knew that as the hours passed, the chances of finding their daughter safe diminished drastically. But giving up was not an option. Even if they had to search for days, they wouldn't rest until they had her back in their arms. As the sun rose in the sky, bringing a new day, the deer stopped abruptly. His ears perked up, attentive to a distant sound, almost imperceptible. Sophia, noticing the change in the deer's behavior, also stopped and looked around. The deer seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear, but she trusted him. He had protected her until now, and she knew he would continue to do so. Then, suddenly, the deer began to move in a different direction, faster and more determined. Sophia, without hesitation, followed him, her small steps trying to keep up with the deer's quickened pace. They moved through the forest with impressive precision, easily avoiding branches and fallen logs. With each step, Sophia felt they were getting closer to something, although she didn't know what. Meanwhile, the villagers began to lose hope. Many had returned home, exhausted and disheartened. Only a few, including Daniel and Elena, continued the search, their faces marked by pain and despair. They refused to accept that all was lost, but the fatigue was beginning to take its toll. Then, in the middle of the morning silence, a faint sound reached Daniel's ears. He stopped abruptly, signaling the others to be quiet. Everyone stood still, trying to catch any sound that might indicate Sophia's presence. And then, they heard it again, a soft sound, like a whisper, coming from deep within the forest. Without a second thought, Daniel and Elena began running in the direction of the sound, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Each step felt like it took an eternity, but the sound of voices became clearer. It was a voice, the voice of Sophia, calling for her parents. They shouted back, their voices mixed with tears of relief and hope. The deer, meanwhile, continued to guide Sophia toward the sound he had picked up. He knew he was leading her to something important, something she needed to find. And finally, when the sound of voices became more distinct, he stopped, allowing Sophia to run ahead. The girl, upon hearing her parents' familiar voices, felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Her steps quickened, and she ran as fast as her little legs could carry her, shouting for her parents with all the strength she had. Daniel and Elena, seeing their daughter emerge from the forest, ran to her, falling to their knees as they embraced her tightly. Tears streamed freely down the faces of all three as they held each other, not wanting to let go. The pain and fear of the past hours melted away, replaced by indescribable relief and overwhelming joy. They had found Sophia, and she was alive, safe. But what left them truly speechless was what happened next. As they still held their daughter, Daniel and Elena noticed the deer standing a few meters away, watching the scene with his wise eyes. He didn't move, just observed them in silence, as if ensuring everything was all right before leaving. Sophia, noticing the deer's presence, looked at him and smiled. She knew he had been her protector, her guide in the darkness. Without thinking, she approached the deer and, in a gesture of gratitude, gently touched his muzzle. The deer, in response, lowered his head as if accepting her thanks. Daniel and Elena watched the scene in shock, not knowing how to react. They had never seen a deer behave in such a way, so close and confident around humans. It was as if he understood what was happening, as if he knew he had fulfilled his duty. Then, without any warning, the deer turned and began walking back into the forest. He moved with grace and dignity, slowly disappearing among the trees. Sophia, still in shock from the reunion with her parents and what had happened, looked into the forest where the deer had disappeared, feeling a deep gratitude in her heart. Sophia's parents, still trying to process everything that had happened, held their daughter tightly, as if fearing to lose her again. But something inside them had changed at that moment. They knew something extraordinary had happened, something that transcended human understanding. The forest, which had once seemed a place of mystery and fear, was now seen with new eyes. For Daniel and Elena, that deer was more than just an animal. He was a guardian, a protector sent in a way they could never fully explain. And so, with hearts full of relief and gratitude, they began the journey back home, holding their daughter in their arms and knowing that, somehow, the forest had returned to them what was most precious. The walk back to the village was made in silence, interrupted only by Sophia's soft sobs, who now rested in her father's arms. The tension and fear that had dominated the previous hours began to dissipate, replaced by a deep calm and gratitude. Daniel and Elena walked side by side, both absorbing the reality of what had happened, but still in disbelief at the magnitude of what they had just experienced. When they arrived at the village, they were greeted with shouts of joy and relief. The villagers, who had spent the night in prayer and anxiety, rushed to meet the small family, expressing their happiness at Sophia's safe return. People hugged Daniel and Elena, tears of joy in their eyes, while they gently touched Sophia, as if to make sure she was really there, safe and sound. However, amid the hugs and words of comfort, Daniel and Elena knew that something deeper needed to be understood. The story of the deer, the mysterious guardian who had protected their daughter in the darkness of the forest, left everyone stunned. Some villagers, who still clung to old legends, whispered that the deer was a protective spirit sent to save her. Others found it hard to believe, trying to rationalize what might have happened that night. But Sophia, with the innocence and clarity that only a child could have, insisted on the truth of her experience. She recounted with impressive detail how the deer had stayed by her side, how he had guided her through the forest, and how, somehow, she knew he was there to protect her. Her sincerity and the emotion in her voice were undeniable, and soon, even the most skeptical began to accept that something extraordinary had happened. The following days were for recovery and reflection. Despite her traumatic experience, Sophia seemed stronger and more resilient than ever. She spent a lot of time with her parents, sharing moments of affection and love that, in a way, helped heal the invisible wounds the night in the forest had left behind. Daniel and Elena, in turn, found comfort in the presence of their daughter and the support of the community. They also began to see the forest with new eyes. What had once been only a place of mystery and fear now became a symbol of protection and miracle. Daniel, who used to avoid the forest, now felt a renewed curiosity and connection with that place. He began to visit the edges of the forest often, not to seek answers, but to feel the peace that emanated from that natural sanctuary. One day, while walking alone along the edge of the forest, Daniel stopped and looked at the trees, their tall branches swaying gently in the wind. He found himself thinking of the deer, the wisdom in its eyes, the way it seemed to understand everything without needing words. He knew there were no coincidences in what happened. The deer had been a blessing, a manifestation of something greater that he could not fully explain. Elena, on the other hand, found solace in her renewed faith. She believed that the deer had been sent by a higher force, proof that miracles could happen in the darkest moments. She began to tell the story of Sophia and the deer to everyone willing to listen, not as a legend or a tale, but as a testimony to the strength of love and divine protection. Life in the village returned to normal as the days passed, but the story of Sophia and the deer became a lasting part of the collective memory. The children listened intently to the story and, in their games, pretended to be majestic deer protecting the defenseless. The adults, in turn, began to see the forest not only as a place of danger, but also as a refuge of protection and mystery. And as for Sophia, the experience left a deep mark on her heart. She never forgot the deer that saved her, and whenever she looked at the forest, she felt a comforting presence, as if the deer were still there, watching her from afar, ready to protect her again if necessary. With time, the story transformed into something bigger than a simple survival narrative. It became a story of hope, of overcoming, and of faith. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, there are invisible forces that watch over us, that guide and protect us when everything seems lost. Daniel, Elena, and Sophia continued with their lives but never forgot the lesson they learned. The deer, to them, would always be more than just an animal. It would be a symbol of resilience, love, and the ability to believe in the impossible. And the forest, once feared, was now seen as a sacred place where miracles could happen. The months passed, and winter gradually gave way to spring, bringing with it new beginnings and a renewal of hope. The story of Sophia and the deer, though still alive in the memory of the villagers, began to turn into a legend, told and retold with admiration and respect. But for Daniel, Elena, and especially for Sophia, it wasn't just a story. It was a truth that had shaped their lives in ways they could never have imagined. As time went on, Sophia returned to playing and running around, but now with a silent wisdom, a deep understanding of what it meant to be cared for and protected. She grew up knowing that life is full of mysteries and that there are times when we must trust in what we cannot see, in what we cannot explain. The connection she felt with the deer during that time in the forest never disappeared, and often she felt his presence beside her, as if he were still there, watching her from afar. Sophia's parents also changed. Daniel, who had once seen life in practical and straightforward terms, now carried a renewed faith. He had learned to see the world with different eyes, recognizing that there are forces greater than we can understand, and that sometimes we are guided by those forces in ways we could never predict. Elena, for her part, found solace in spirituality, feeling more connected to the universe and grateful for her daughter's life, saved by what she believed was a divine miracle. As the seasons continued to change, Sophia began to visit the forest alone, not with fear, but with a deep respect and a sense of peace. She would walk among the trees, feeling the soft breeze on her face, listening to the sounds of nature around her, and always looking for signs of the deer that had saved her. Although she never saw him again, she knew in her heart that he was there somehow, watching over her, ready to protect her again if needed. Sophia also started helping others in small but significant ways, inspired by the care she had received. Whenever she found injured animals or those in need, she would take them in, care for them, as if she were repaying the kindness the deer had shown her. She grew up to be a young woman with a generous heart, and the story of her rescue continued to inspire those around her. The seasons continued to pass, and the village prospered. The villagers, now more connected to the nature around them, began to protect the forest, respecting its secrets and the sanctuary it represented. The legend of the deer became an important part of the village's identity, a constant reminder that there are more things between heaven and earth than we can comprehend. Sophia grew up, became an adult, but the little girl who had once been protected by a deer in the forest never completely left her. Even when she became a mother, she told the story to her own children, passing on the wisdom and lessons she had learned. The story of her survival wasn't just a tale of bravery or a miracle. It was proof that, in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. And so, the story of Sophia and the deer continued to be told, passed down from generation to generation. The deer, who had protected a helpless child in the darkness of the forest, became an eternal symbol of love, protection, and the unwavering belief that there is always something or someone watching over us, even when we cannot see it. The forest, forever marked by the presence of that deer, remained a place of mystery and sanctuary. The villagers, as they passed by it, felt an indescribable calm, a sense of security that couldn't be explained, only felt. They knew the forest held secrets, but they also knew that within it, there was something pure and good, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the story of Sophia and the deer reminds us that life is made up of inexplicable moments, of unlikely encounters, and of an invisible web of protection that keeps us safe, even in the most challenging times. It's a story of faith, hope, and love, a reminder that even when we feel lost, there is always a way back home, guided by those who care for us, seen or unseen.